Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Snow drifted through a cold, gray sky on Christmas morning 2011 as a 39-year-old caver descended into a cave system in northern UK. He was treating himself and his friends to a holiday excursion in Britain's longest cave system. Once they reached Melusin Hall, his Christmas celebration turned into a nightmare. In an instant, one caver was knocked unconscious and trapped below the freezing ground while his friends desperately tried to save him. This is the story of the Melusin Hall rescue. Melusin Hall is a section of Britain's longest cave network, the Gill Cave System. Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video. Bill Taylor and George Carnot first discovered Gill back in 1946, and since then, spelunkers found that this system connects over 10 different caves. The whole system is over 41 miles long, and it's sometimes called the Three Counties Cave System because it tunnels beneath Cumbria, Lancashire, and North Yorkshire. The caves here are composed of Carboniferous and Great Scar limestone that's been eroded over time as waters collect and drain into Lech Beck. The man behind this story asked the news not to release his name, so we'll call him Charles. Charles was over 6 feet tall and hefty. Caving is best suited for small and thin individuals. Smaller people can better contort through tight passages, and less body weight means the body's muscles don't have to work as hard to move. Both of these benefits make caving easier, leading to better stamina and less fatigue during long caving sessions. In Charles's favor, his body weight gave him better insulation against the cold, which was good since the snowy weather chilled the already cold caves. Charles could always handle himself in any situation he encountered, but his build could become a problem if he was encumbered or injured. To get to Melusin Hall, the team of 3 cavers could enter through multiple routes. They were advanced spelunkers, so they went for a dangerous route. They entered the Gill system via a mysterious passage that was hidden from cavers for over 25 years. They took the route from Mancunian Way, which is near the exit of Cornah Cavern. From the exit of Cornah, the team traveled along the mossy rock walls and trampled over carpets of decaying leaves that piled up in the divot where the ground and stone meet. Eventually, they come across a thin opening where a slab had dislodged and rolled away. Through this narrow squeeze, they reached a hole in the ground. One by one, the party descended the small hole in the ground feet first, unable to see what lay below them. When Charles started the descent, he immediately realized this route could be a problem. His hefty frame turned the cave's very first obstacle into a real struggle. His face went red as he held his breath to shrink his waist, giving him just barely enough space to push downward. Once at the bottom, they had to crouch in a tunnel that was filled with bits of gravel from years of water flow. Should the snow overhead turn to water, their entrance could become a shower. They'd lose their footing as the flow starts to pull rocks down the passageway. So far, they were lucky enough. The pebbled floor was only glistening with a thin layer of dew. After several feet of altering terrain, the cavers found themselves in a muddy room that gave them some space to stretch out. But their fortune wouldn't last long. They had to duck into another hole that connected to more gravel. Next, they had to suffer through another claustrophobic squeeze as they wormed across the rough rocks below. From there, the cavers found a room of large boulders. Charles marveled at the huge mounds of stone. Cavers are forbidden to touch many of the delicate rock formations found in caves to prevent them from being broken. Even a little bit of excess mud, oil from his skin, or acidity from his sweat could cause damage to rare and intricate speleoforms. However, these boulders were just plain rock, so he allowed himself to drag his palms across their rough surface. He looked up at the ceiling and wondered how these massive stones could have reached here. The pebbles made sense. Almost all of the passageways so far had been thin and narrow, so rocks would break apart in tiny bits as the water rolled over the limestone. But here, There were no massive holes above. Maybe the chamber was weaker than the surrounding passages, and the boulders broke apart in large chunks in some catastrophic and rumbling cave-in that happened some unknown millennia ago. It's easy to think about caves in the past tense. They're usually formed over millions of years, which is an unthinkable timescale for humans. The dark and silent passages of caves feel like they were completed in ancient times. The raging waters and glaciers that cut through the rock had long since dried out, leaving empty, abandoned, and dead tunnels shrouded in darkness. But, as any caver unlucky enough to witness it will tell you, these caves and the waters that form them are still very much alive with activity. Charles washed away his thoughts of the boulders and the stillness that surrounded them as they climbed the rocks to find a thin layer of stone with a gap below the ceiling. They crawled through it, trekked through another passage, up through a hole, and across various other twists and turns until they reached a connection to County Pot. This cave was well known, and ropes were in place to help cavers descend into the shadows below. This section could have been the end of their journey. The rope led to an entrance high overhead that extended out into the open air above. Water can easily flood this section, making travel impossible beyond this point. Charles and his team squinted up to see only a small stream of water trickling down. They pressed on. Through a series of holes, they entered another boulder with a huge platform in the center. There, the group climbed up the rocks along the wall and through another narrow cutaway near the ceiling. After more twists and turns, they entered the main waterway of this portion of the cave before entering Melusin Hall. This area was named for the shells of dead creatures that were deposited here from the waters above, and the rocky walls here were formed from ancient shells that were compressed into stone. Although the waters up to this point were tame, the waters here were loud and aggressive. In the main section before the hall, waters were frothing and splashing against the rocks. The flow brought cold drafts of air, and the sound filled the chamber, creating a painful wall of noise. The team started to worry as they tiptoed over narrow cliffs to reach the hall. Charles had to grasp the walls of the cave as he shimmied across the walkway. His gruff hands struggled against the small handholds along the way. Charles got a little dizzy when he realized that his strength couldn't save him here. If he fell, he was a goner. Once inside Melusin Hall, Charles and his team took a much-needed break. They rested their gear against the walls, and one of them sat down on the muddied floor. They started eating some energy bars and traded stories about their Christmas plans. Some had already opened presents the night before. One caver told them his wife had given him a gift the day before, and he wished he could take her to experience this thrilling adventure. She told him many times her outdoor spirit was as far as the woods, and that was it. She wasn't moved by his dream of caving together, and she asked him to get home soon. He would have to clean up and look nice for the family coming over for Christmas dinner. Charles could relate. He laughed and threw his body against the rocky side of Melusin Hall. As he leaned against the sides of the chamber to take some pressure off his feet, he thought of his own family safe and warm up above. He could almost hear the laughter of children reaching for stockings and the crackling of a fireplace. Except the sound got louder. It started to sound almost hollow and full of low, rumbling bass. The quick snaps he heard in his head crested into a tremendous roar as the rock split over his head. A massive boulder dislodged from the ceiling, rolling down another rock and sliding into Charles. Dust and dirt showered Melusin Hall as his friends shielded their eyes and ducked for cover. A cloud of dust still hovered in the air after the rumbling stopped. One friend called out, asking if everyone was all right. The other friend reached out and grabbed him, whispering to be quiet. Any loud sounds could shake more dust loose and cause a deeper rock slide. These two were accounted for, but Charles was silent. As the dust settled, they saw what had happened. The impact of the boulder had thrust Charles to the ground and pinned his leg to the rocky floor below. Even through dust, without full vision of the scene, the cavers could see that Charles's foot and part of his lower leg were bent upward in an impossible direction. They scrambled to the ground and wrestled with the boulder. In the best case scenario, Charles could walk it off and climb out of the cave. Otherwise, he could be injured, and in that case, the boulder could cut off circulation. In a worst case scenario, moving the boulder could cause more damage if it rolled the wrong way, or if the pressure bent his bones as it rolled off of him. His friends weren't thinking about the possibilities. They heaved the freshly carved stone off of him, sending it rolling a few times down the grooved floor of the cave. As the boulder's thudding tumble came to a halt, they bent down and tried to communicate with Charles, but he gave no response. He lay motionless on the floor as his friends gingerly checked for his breath and pulse. He was alive, but they couldn't risk moving him. In the chaos of the cave-in, they weren't sure what part of him the boulder had hit. Even though he had no visible head injuries, moving him could cause permanent damage to his nerves, or cause any internal damage rupture, sending blood or cerebral fluid into his brain. His leg was still twisted from the impact, but it flopped to the floor, completely broken where the boulder had been. Blood began to soak through his overalls. He had a compound fracture that pushed his shin through his skin. There was no way Charles was getting out of Melusin Hall without help. One caver instructed the other to stay with their unconscious friend while he climbed the rope out of the nearest exit. At around 6 p.m., just a short time before they were scheduled to leave the cave, the climber exited the nearby pothole. He immediately called for help. Emergency personnel contacted the Clapham Cave Rescue Organization. The Clapham team is one of the most elite rescue squads in the UK. They dispatched 30 volunteers to the scene, each equipped with their signature red jackets emblazoned with the logo of the British Cave Rescue Council. Along with the main group, 9 other volunteers from the Kendal Mountain Rescue Team and the Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association also joined them. The Kendal squad specializes in outdoor rescues in snowy environments. They come well equipped with thermal protection, and their off-road ambulances would be vital for reaching the obscure entrance that Charles and his team used to enter the E-Skill system. The teams brought helmets in case more falling rock was dislodged during the rescue. They also brought radios and rock shoring equipment to break apart any boulders that might have cut off the exits. Reports said the boulder had been moved off of Charles, but that could mean it was a few feet away from him or a few inches. They had to be sure they had enough space to get him out. It only took rescuers 20 minutes to arrive at an entrance closer to the hall. In the meantime, Charles had woken up. His pain was intense, but only his leg was seriously hurt. The rest of him was fine. As adrenaline shot through his body, he frantically told his friend that they needed to get out of this chamber. His friend helped him walk his hands up the side of Melusin Hall so he could stand on his one good leg. Together, they bravely inched toward the main chamber below the nearest pothole. But after only a few minutes, the pain gripped him once more, and Charles couldn't go any further. Together, they stayed on the rocky floor and waited. Minutes later, rescuers rappelled and climbed down the nearby rope. They saw Charles almost immediately and administered painkillers to quell his screaming. The team busted out a kit and used it to split his leg to prevent more damage. Together, the rescuers lifted him onto a solid stretcher and carried him to the vertical chamber. His massive body complicated this step. He was a little too long for the stretcher, and his weight challenged the rescuers to maintain their grip and balance as they waddled through the cave. The third caver had to wait at the bottom while the team connected the stretcher to the ropes. Since the cave already had anchor points and ropes, the rescue operation was smooth and fast. They only needed some extra hands to hold Charles's weight. It only took them an hour to get him out of the pothole. Once at the surface, the teams brought him to the awaiting Kendal team ambulance. Normally, rescues end here, but the next part of the trip was just as hazardous as the cave. The snowy weather had met with a warm front, turning the snow into a thick mist that blinded the roadways. After a slow drive, they rendezvoused with a second ambulance waiting at Bullpot Farm, the humble abode where many caving teams travel to prior to their adventures below ground. Even though the rescue team got to Charles quickly, the return drive stretched the total rescue time to over 6 hours. It was midnight when the rescue ended. By then, Christmas had come and gone. Charles was safe, but he, his crew, and the 39 rescuers all missed their scheduled holiday plans. That's one of the many sacrifices that professional cavers have to make. To support their fellow spelunkers, they remain on call 24/7. Instead of dinner and presents, Charles celebrated the gift of life with his friends and family, all thanks to the brave rescuers who dared to venture into the depths of Melusin Hall. "31-year-old Christopher Zitzowitz and his friend Caleb Ritchie went to Gifford Pinchot National Forest to find new caves. The pair left their truck by the roadside and walked on foot into the wilderness with Washington's Mount St. Helens in the distance. Then, an abnormally dangerous storm brought record-breaking rainfall and unseasonal snowstorms. The pair got separated on October 12th. 3 other hikers were caught in the storm. Rescue teams searched from the air, along the ground, and into the caves to find them. Some would be saved, but Christopher was never seen again. This is the tragedy of the Big Lava Bed Caves. The fall weather attracts travelers from far and wide to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. It's the perfect time for hikers and cavers to visit, since the pesky bugs are starting to die off, and photographers come to see the fall leaves on vine maples and other unique foliage. This park is home to one of the most notorious volcanoes in history, Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is an active volcano built on layers of lava stretching to an elevation 8,363 feet high. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending a cloud of ash 80,000 feet into the sky, which later fell across 11 different states. This catastrophe was the deadliest and costliest volcanic eruption in U.S. history. It destroyed 47 bridges, 200 homes, 185 miles of roadways, and killed 57 people. During the devastation, a 5.1 magnitude earthquake shook the ground, forming a landslide that left a 1-mile-wide crater below where the peak once stood. Scientists predict future eruptions will be even worse. Eruptions from Mount St. Helens created a twisting network of lava tubes below ground as molten lava cooled on the surface, allowing magma within to flow through. Once the magma flow ceased, the hollow tubes were left barren below ground. In addition to lava tube caves, Gifford Pinchot also has a huge amount of caves formed from erosion and fault shifting as well. As of 2018, the U.S. Forest Service has found 600 caves in the area, though there could be many more yet to be discovered. There are so many caves that scientists haven't been able to uncover them all yet. And since eruptions create new layers of ground, there could be miles of old caves buried deeper out of sight. Features like these make Gifford Pinchot Forest a caver's dream. Few places in the world have such easy access to unexplored caves. Many cavers have traveled to the forest to make their mark on history and discover a new cave or new unexplored passages. However, the forest's vast collection of caves poses a significant problem for rescuers. Cavers could easily get lost on the surface and mistake one entrance for another. Rescuers could waste precious time exploring the wrong cave, or rescuers might not even be able to find the right cave at all. Then, once rescuers begin crawling and climbing their way through the muddy tunnels below ground, they could easily miss new, unexplored, or unmapped passages which could form suddenly and without warning from cave-ins or other natural phenomena. Like many adventurers in the 2010s, Christopher had no memory of the devastation wrought by Mount St. Helens. Like many, he was drawn to the area for its natural beauty and the allure of caving. Christopher and Caleb took their first trip to the forest in search of a cave, to test their might and explore where no human has seen before. The pair went searching on the southern edge of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in a region called the Big Lava Bed. The sky was dark and gloomy that day. The distant rumbling of thunder hushed the sounds of wildlife as birds and squirrels hurried for shelter. Instead of fleeing from the dreary sky, Christopher and Caleb drove into the storm. Christopher brought a buddy with him, which is proper caving protocol. The two parked their truck by the side of an outback road. Rain started to fall, but it was light for now. They were used to the outdoors, and a little water didn't scare them. They unflinchingly began hiking toward the Big Lava Bed in search of the namesake cave of the area, the Big Lava Bed Cave. The Big Lava Bed is a flat region of land where a smaller lava spout covered the ground with lava thousands of years ago. The dense, metallic rock left little soil for trees to grow, leaving a barren land with grass and lichens sprawling across the 8-mile-long perimeter of the feature. Caving in this area may be exciting, but it's also extremely dangerous for new cavers since there are few available resources for adventurers. There are virtually no maps of the interior of the caves available to the public, and there are no above-ground maps showing their location. That means cavers must pay fees to local caving clubs for access to their maps and pray that the maps are up to date. The Oregon Grotto branch of the National Speleological Society said they would be listing 200 caves on their website, but so far, the links to all of their maps are currently broken. Hikers new to caving might not even know about the Grotto clubs or the NSS, so they're out of luck if they want to explore caves near Mount St. Helens. The Big Lava Bed is also far off the beaten path. There are no roads that reach this remote spot of wilderness, so cavers, hikers, and rescuers alike all have to travel a good distance on foot just to begin their exploration. The pair were dressed light, ready for a hike, but ill-equipped to handle the dangerous atmosphere below ground. The weather also began to turn. They noticed it was getting colder, and their windbreakers wouldn't be enough to keep them warm. But it wasn't quite winter yet, so they carried on. Soon, the rain turned into a deluge. The rain blanketed the sky. The rain lowered their visibility. It was so hard to see that they began to get disoriented, but they wanted to find the cave, so they decided to split up to search for the Big Lava Bed Cave. That way, they could cover more ground. The storm raged on, and eventually the rain turned to snow. But the volume didn't change. A full-fledged blizzard swept through the forest, and Christopher and Caleb were out of sight. They each checked their cell phones, but there was no reception. They were too far away from the cell towers, and the storm was interfering with what little signal could reach this far. With no way to communicate, Christopher kept searching for the cave. Meanwhile, Caleb Ritchie turned around to search for Christopher. He tried his best, but the storm was too dense. He searched for around 2 hours before returning to the road where they parked the truck. As he opened the truck door, he hoped Christopher would be waiting in the other seat, but the truck was empty. Caleb was uneasy, but the truck would be the logical place to meet, so Caleb waited. Eventually, Christopher looked at his compass to reorient himself. As the snow continued to fall, he knew he had to abandon his mission, find Caleb, and get to safety. But his compass was malfunctioning. The device hadn't suffered any physical damage, but the needle was spinning. Cavers will frequently use compasses to guide them underground, and Christopher's compass should have been doubly useful since the Big Lava Bed has little to no features, just vast, empty plains. Christopher was getting frustrated. Why wasn't his compass working? Unfortunately, he didn't know that the Big Lava Bed and its caves have many unique death traps waiting to ensnare unsuspecting travelers. Normal rock layers found in caves or on Earth's surface aren't magnetic, even though they may contain magnetic minerals. That's because these magnetic minerals are dispersed evenly throughout the rock, so their fields either interfere with one another or they end up having little total charge. But the heat of the lava can create more magnetic minerals as the rocks meld and recombine to form different compounds. These magnetic minerals are free to move through the lava, so they end up attracting each other and combine to create much stronger magnetic fields, which can interfere with the Earth's magnetic North Pole. Christopher was walking on a giant magnet. In desperation, he looked to the sky. Finding a cave on the barren ground was hard without landmarks, but he could figure out his relative position by looking at Mount St. Helens and the surrounding coniferous forest. These landmarks are visible in the distance under normal circumstances, but in the storm, these few defining features were hidden. Christopher looked at his compass again. This time, it stayed in one direction. He looked ahead and walked forward into the unknown. Meanwhile, above ground, further past the big lava bend, 3 hikers were also caught in the strange storm. Matt Margiotta and Kyla Arnold were undertaking the monumental journey along the Pacific Crest Trail. The Pacific Crest Trail is a 2,500-mile-long trail that reaches all the way from Mexico to Canada. They began their trip in February and had been hiking for 8 months. Like Christopher, they thought a little rain wouldn't stop them. Margiotta and Arnold kept online hiking journals that detailed their progress and their experience along the massive trail. Kyla's last few journal entries reminisced about how she and Matt had been living together for 3 months in Arizona. She wrote how the pair hiked together and how he brought her joy. However, shortly before the monstrous storm engulfed them all, her writing took a dark turn. Kyla said her happiness was, quote, followed by a dark, lonely shadow of fear that she never seems to escape. She continued with more ominous lines like, quote, must I bear the sins of us all? And her last journal entry ends with a bit of optimism, saying, quote, I think tomorrow I'll bike to work, bright and early. Her sunny outlook would quickly turn. Matt and Kyla had just escaped a life-or-death situation only a few days prior to reaching the forest above Big Lava Bed Cave. An earlier storm swept through the southern part of Washington, trapping them in their tarp. Arnold wrote how the pair were almost out of food. Her and Margiotta had to sit close under their tarp, combining their body heat for just a chance at survival. They escaped that hell and made it to the small town of Trout Lake. There, they met a woman who was also hiking the whole 2,500-mile distance of the Pacific Crest Trail. Like them, Alejandra Wilson also kept a journal of her journey online. Like Christopher and Caleb, these 3 also saw the coming storm on the horizon. The locals of the small town told the hikers they couldn't make it. Kyla was terrified after her recent brush with death, but she felt she and Matt had traveled too far to give up on their mission now. Wilson wished them good luck and departed a few days before them. Wilson's last journal update told how she nicknamed them Make Do and Coconut, and how the 3 talked about their adventures. 4 days later, and Wilson was soaked from the same storm battering Christopher and Caleb. Since she left before the other hikers, she got stranded before them. Wilson found herself stuck at her campsite for 7 days as the storm relentlessly hammered the volcanic forest. On that fateful day, a sleep-deprived Wilson awoke to find the rain turned to ice. The ice was layered so thick she couldn't open her tent. Overnight, 6 inches of snow fell, and there was no end in sight. Like Christopher, she remembered a road nearby. And even though she had no idea where it led, she thought it would be her only chance to survive. However, once she packed up her things to begin hiking, she realized the trail leading to the road was gone, covered in snow. The rest of her journal shows her panic as she faced what could have been her death. She wrote the word help in the snow. Her hands weren't moving right. She couldn't grip the zipper on her tarp. And she lost all hope. Alejandra Wilson had been reported missing after she missed her scheduled check-in with her family. Wilson was missing in a different part of the county, but Christopher, Matt, and Kyla were relatively close by. Just hours before Caleb reported that Christopher Zitzovitz was missing, Matt and Kyla miraculously got just enough cell reception to call for help. Rescuers were dispatched on the ground to save Matt and Kyla. They had obtained the hikers' exact GPS coordinates, so they made a mad dash directly to them. A team of 5 rescuers went along the trail and got less than a mile away from Matt and Kyla, but the snowfall and the darkness of nightfall forced them to turn around. 18 rescuers arrived at the big lava bed to search for Christopher. They requested a helicopter, but they were getting flack from authorities. Normally, Tons of people volunteer to save people trapped in caves or trapped along trails. Why were so few people sent to save Christopher and the others? Why were requests for aerial support denied? Well, it turns out that they were all somehow even more unlucky. This whole rescue operation took place during a U.S. government shutdown caused by gridlocked political debate. That meant typical Forest Services and search and rescue teams weren't available. Of course, rescuers were contacted, but the centralized command was broken. Rescuers had to be called one at a time. It was slow and disorganized. Some paid rescuers would have volunteered their services for free since the government wasn't paying their salaries during the shutdown, but some were never even contacted. The 3 stranded hikers were decently prepared. They needed a lot more gear for their intense journey up the U.S. They had food, stoves, multiple layers of clothes, insulated jackets, cold weather pants, sleeping bags, gloves, and ski masks. But Christopher only brought hiking gear and no real caving equipment despite his plan to explore Big Lava Bed Cave. He had a helmet, but it was a bike helmet designed to reduce air resistance with breathable holes, which wouldn't give proper protection underground. In caves, even a small pebble could cut open his exposed scalp, and a falling stalactite could be deadly. That helmet wouldn't save him. Even though the odds were stacked against Christopher, rescuers had to turn their attention to Matt and Kyla since they knew exactly where to find them. The rescue effort was significant for the 2 hikers, but since Christopher was a caver, his situation was far more complicated, and specialized cave rescuers were needed. As the team assigned to save Matt and Kyla backtracked to save themselves, they also got stuck. That was the last straw. The search had to be called off, which halted the additional teams who had just begun looking for Christopher. A helicopter was eventually dispatched, but it also had to turn around because of the storm. Rescuers couldn't search for anyone for another day, which was hell for the 4 missing people, but the day of waiting allowed rescuers from all over the country time to gather and plan their search. By the time the storm let up, roughly 3 feet of snow had fallen over the desolate Big Lava Bed. A helicopter finally came to extract the rescuers. Then the chopper also located Matt and Kyla, freezing from their frozen hell. They required immediate medical assistance to stave off frostbite, and they were severely dehydrated. Even though they were surrounded by frozen water, they couldn't open their tent to drink it, or the precious heat they trapped inside would vanish. Rescuers then turned their attention towards Christopher and Alejandra. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office led the search and rescue operation, and now that the storm had passed, they got aid from 2 Coast Guard helicopters to search from the skies. Ground teams fanned out along the snow-covered forest, calling his name and searching for any sign of him. Other vehicles, like snowmobiles and off-road capable trucks, aided the ground search, providing light and storage for the rescuers on foot. If they found Christopher, the vehicles could give him much-needed shelter to warm up. 2 canine units were also brought to the scene to search for him. 18 people were there on Wednesday, 4 days after he first went missing, but later, over 100 people gathered to search for Christopher. Caleb told them he could be inside a cave, but rescuers were hesitant to delve below ground. Some lava tubes form with weak ceilings, and they end up collapsing under their own weight, forming deep ruts in the ground instead of tunnels. Christopher might have taken shelter in one of these unstable lava tubes. The cold temperatures from the storm might have weakened the rock, and the added weight of the snow above could have cracked the ceilings, causing a cave-in, burying him under tons of rubble. To avoid that risk, they wanted to look for any visible signs of trouble on the surface first. But as another day ticked by, rescuers had to turn their attention below ground. The Big Lava Bed Cave, the one Christopher was supposedly searching for, was once part of a larger lava tube that formed at ground level before part of it collapsed. However, some of the lava tube descends further down, And through the rubble of the collapsed tunnel, another entrance beckons below a cracked, overhanging rock formation. At 645 feet in length, Big Lava Bed's cave is a mixture of lava tubes and cave passages made by erosion. If Christopher found the cave, he might have taken shelter inside. The rescue team had to hike around a 40-foot-tall lava ridge to reach the entrance. Once on the other side, they came to what remained of a lava channel that descended into a large hole in the ground. Like many caves in the area, parts of the roof had collapsed, lining the entryway with boulders. The large open area extends 115 feet before becoming a lava tube inhabited by bats. Deeper on, the lava tube turned into a vertical drop, followed by a large ramp with collapsed passages extending into the room. With a mixture of vertical and horizontal passages, Big Lava Bed's cave could easily flood after so much rainfall. The cave was mapped once before, but the survey team found additional passages that required digging to pass through. A new breakdown could have allowed Christopher to pass through into unknown territory, where maps would fail to aid the rescuers. With no sign of Christopher in Big Lava Bed Cave, rescuers ducked into other caves nearby, like the 455-foot-long chambermaid cave with its knotted passages connecting to 4 large sinkholes that required ropes to traverse. And at the bottom, each of the holes have more passageways to explore. Christopher could have easily slipped and fell into the abyss. Just beyond the junction that connects all the main passages, Chambermaid Cave has a tight squeeze followed by a steep decline that ends in a small hole too small for people to go down. If Christopher found himself there, he could have been stuck, unable to climb out, weak, dehydrated, and too cold to move. If the passage broke apart, he could have fallen down the slippery ramp, tumbling 120 feet along a tube that continues into a slide into the darkness. Rescuers even poke their heads into small caves, like the Berry Cave, which is only 45 feet long, and the Backed Up Cave, which is only 85 feet long. These smaller caves would be easy to check, but some of the caves would be challenging and time-consuming. The extreme conditions and lack of government funding meant that the cave rescuers were worn thin. Many of the caves were only checked with cursory glances into their various entryways. The rescuers' shouts and their lights wouldn't travel very far into the cave. If Christopher was still alive when they got to whatever cave he was in, he would have no way of knowing. Outside of limited human resources, there were other concerns for finding Christopher in a cave. Rescue cavers struggled to locate the exact locations of the caves under so much snow. If Christopher had taken shelter below ground, the packed snow would have sealed the exit to his cave completely shut. If the freezing temperatures didn't get him, the sealed room would fill with carbon dioxide and suffocate him. Maybe he thought he could start a fire inside to keep warm, but that would have made him run out of air even faster. Some of the caves would have likely been flooded already, trapping him on both sides as the snow covered the exit. The rescue team had to be careful around caves because some spelunkers have experienced strange pitfalls in the ground. Some have reported walking when suddenly the ground gave out from under them. A hole barely big enough for a foot to fall through opened in the ground. Below, the sound of a boulder breaking loose from inside the cave crashed down a dark shaft. It's possible spontaneous sinkholes like these grabbed Christopher and dragged him to his doom. Maybe the snow covered a sinkhole just enough for Christopher to think it was solid ground. The nearby Wolf's Pit is so deep, it requires a rope to enter. So if he fell in there, he'd either die from the impact, or the snow would bury him alive as it kept piling up. There are long crevices in the area. Maybe he stepped too close to a ledge and it shattered, sending him plummeting into the darkness. Suddenly, the rescue team felt a surge of adrenaline. One of the dogs found Christopher's tracks. His footprints followed alongside a small stream. Following the flow of water is a classic way to find caves. Resurgences can easily mark an exit, or streams could dip below ground into the entrance of a cave. However, the storm changed Christopher's plans, or maybe his compass led him astray. The dog led rescuers along the river until his footsteps abruptly turned. They kept going along that direction, and then eventually looped. Christopher was walking in circles. The rescuers were confused. Then they found he had doubled back again and again, walking back and forth, making no progress as the snowstorm got worse and his chances of finding his way back got slimmer and slimmer. Eventually, the group searching for Wilson was called off. She had escaped the frozen wasteland and made it to the road where a motorcyclist saw her, and only later realized who she was. Once he informed the rescue team, they found her about 20 miles away from where Matt and Kyla were saved. The Wilson team realized they had been too far north. Just like them, it's possible the group looking for Christopher was completely wrong about his whereabouts. They knew he was looking for Big Lava Bed Cave, but Christopher could have found a completely different cave instead. Christopher could have made it into a lava tube cave, but he could have died before rescuers even arrived. In many caves, a stumble and a shortfall could hurt. Cavers could sprain their wrist or bruise some bones, but it's the big falls they have to worry about. In lava caves, though, a shortfall could be deadly. The hardening lava forms metallic spikes and sharp edges that can easily cause deep gashes in a victim's flesh. Simply bumping your head could split your skin open into a mortal wound. And without the proper first aid, someone trapped in a cave like Christopher could easily bleed out. As the days passed by, the rescuers left, and only search parties remained until eventually even the search was called off. Christopher's sister, Laura, and a group of 3 others, including Richie, kept searching. They drove, honking their car horns, and brought a megaphone so that their voices would carry. They divided up the landscape and used maps to create checkpoints so that they could cover the area more effectively. Since no one knew exactly which cave Christopher could be in, cave rescue teams didn't continue to aid the grieving family. It turned out, Big Lava Bed Cave was right by the road Christopher and Caleb had traveled on. They had been searching in the wrong place the whole time. Time moved on. The National Parks Division, in charge of the area, moved on to different concerns. Law enforcement turned their attention to newer cases. Forest Services removed every cave from all available maps of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest to stop people from entering them. However, true cavers won't be deterred. They'll find a way, and it'll only make it harder for rescuers to find them if updated maps aren't available. Some have claimed that the National Park Service withholds information about people who vanished in their parks out of fear that knowledge of their absence would deter guests. Some investigations claim that nearly 2,000 people go missing in the national parks each year, and while roughly 80% are eventually found, that leaves a shocking number of people who have disappeared completely in the years since Christopher vanished. Matt and Kyla moved on with their lives, and Wilson started a trail comic dubbed Rock On, Rocket Llama. While the journals of most of the people involved are still accessible, Christopher's was deleted. Christopher Zitzowitz was last seen wearing tan pants, a black raincoat, and a black backpack. He also had brown and tan hiking boots and a high-visibility orange bracelet made from parachute cord, similar to what cavers might use for rope. Somewhere below ground in the state of Washington, that small bit of orange rope likely marks his grave. Blue Springs State Park in Florida is like heaven for scuba divers. With proper certification, divers can explore an underwater world that descends 120 feet into crystal clear water, in addition to a dream-like maze of winding rock formations and passageways. The spring is also home to a large population of manatees. It seems like something out of a Disney movie. But in reality, there's a reason why the park requires diving certification. It's quite dangerous. And while accidents here are not common, they do happen. One of the worst took place in October of 2013. Two divers had a serious catastrophe under the surface of Blue Spring. Not only did it make headline news around the country, but it also left Volusia County in a state of deep shock and fear. The event. October 9th, 2013 was a Wednesday. It may have been the middle of fall, but in central Florida it was warm, sunny, and characteristically beautiful. Samuel Slack, a 36-year-old diving enthusiast from Edgewater, was headed to Blue Spring State Park. Along with him was his friend and diving partner Daniel Van Sickle, a 37-year-old from New Smyrna Beach. Like many who came to visit Blue Spring Park, Slack and Van Sickle were intending to scuba dive. Both men had loaded up on all the essential diving equipment. But for Samuel Slack, there was one thing missing. He didn't have the proper certification to dive below 60 feet. His diving partner, Daniel Van Sickle, had previously obtained an open water and advanced certificate in New Smyrna Beach, but he was alone in that. Sometime in the early afternoon, both divers drove up to the entrance of Blue Spring State Park. According to its website, Blue Spring State Park requires that all divers show proof of certification before entering the water. It also says that divers must leave their certifications visible on the dashboard of their parked car. What Samuel Slack did have, according to the Daytona Beach News Journal, was a novice open water diver card. This card meant that Slack was legally allowed to enter the water with his diving gear, but he wasn't allowed to dive deep. Upon arrival, both men signed paperwork promising that they would not dive below 60 feet that day. Thanks to this, once they were inside the park, both Samuel Slack and diving partner Daniel Van Sickle were able to assemble their gear and hop in, fins and all, without any further objection from park rangers or other local authorities. The water in Blue Spring is a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Midday, in the middle of the week, it would have been pristine. Balmy sunshine, cool, clear water, and less crowded than in summer or on a weekend. Despite the open underwater space, Slack and Van Sickle intended to stick together for safety reasons. This is actually something the Florida State Park Service requires divers to do. Every diver must have a diving buddy, and they must stay together for the entirety of the dive. The two men may have been following this particular safety protocol, but, as records later collected from their wrist-worn diving computer show, they certainly weren't holding true to their signed agreement not to dive below 60 feet. Records show that Van Sickle and Slack dove as deep as 116 feet, virtually hitting the bottom of the deepest recesses of Blue Spring. Now, despite breaking the rules, everything appeared to be going well for Slack and Van Sickle, but then, at around 90 feet below the surface, Slack turned to Van Sickle and made a gesture that still haunts him to this day. Using his finger, Slack made a slashing motion across his own neck. Van Sickle could see there was panic in his diving partner's eyes. This slashing motion was Samuel Slack trying to communicate that he wasn't getting any oxygen. In an effort to calm him down, Daniel Van Sickle took off his own regulator and handed it to the frantic Samuel Slack. This is a technique known as buddy breathing, where one person breathes through the regulator for a short time before handing it back to the other person. By temporarily sharing oxygen this way, Van Sickle hoped he'd be able to buy enough time for Slack to regain focus and attempt to get back out of the water alive. But instead, when it came time for Slack to return the regulator to Van Sickle, he wouldn't give it up. Van Sickle pleaded with him, trying to signal that he needed a turn breathing the oxygen. Slack wouldn't budge. Eventually, in tragic desperation, Daniel Van Sickle reached over and snatched his regulator out of the mouth of Samuel Slack. Van Sickle immediately swam all the way up to the surface to call for help. From the water, he yelled to a park maintenance worker and said they should call 911 immediately. Just before 3 p.m., emergency crews in Volusia County were notified of the situation at Blue Spring Park, and personnel were immediately sent to the location. Right after getting the attention of the maintenance worker, Daniel Van Sickle dove back underwater and swam all the way back down to where Samuel Slack still was. 100 feet below. This was perfectly reasonable given the circumstances, but as some of you may already know, swimming rapidly from a depth of 90 feet to the surface and then back down to 90 feet again is normally a really bad idea. Normally, divers are very careful about making periodic stops on their ascent back up from deep underwater. Otherwise, they risk contracting the uniquely horrific condition of decompression sickness. Decompression sickness is essentially when bubbles are formed in your body tissue, and it is exactly what hit Daniel Van Sickle like a ton of bricks while trying to rescue his diving partner. Also known by its nickname, the Bends, decompression sickness can be excruciatingly painful, and in extreme cases, it can even rapidly kill you. Pushing his body to the limit, Van Sickle arrived next to Slack, but this time found him simply floating in place. There was something eerie about the stillness of Slack's body. Nevertheless, Van Sickle wasted no time in continuing to try and rescue his friend and diving partner. Van Sickle was able to inflate Slack's vest, which provided enough flotation for Van Sickle to carry Slack's motionless body up to the surface. The aftermath. Paramedics arrived at Blue Spring State Park that afternoon to find 2 divers in need of immediate medical attention. One was the unconscious Samuel Slack, and the other was Daniel Van Sickle, who was now succumbing to unbearable decompression sickness. Both men's lives were in serious danger. Van Sickle was rushed to a hospital in nearby Orlando and placed in a hyperbaric chamber. This is an intensive treatment used by Navy SEALs for the most extreme cases of decompression sickness. Meanwhile, rescue workers attempted to revive Samuel Slack on the shore. Sadly, they were unsuccessful. Slack was pronounced dead on sight, the victim of what was later ruled an accidental drowning. Eventually, Van Sickle was released from the hospital, but despite having survived, he now had to deal not only with the death of his friend, but being the center of an investigation. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office inspected all of the equipment that was used that day, analyzed dive records from both men's wrist-worn computers, and they also questioned Van Sickle. Van Sickle provided an account of the events that was consistent with the dive records. But later, according to the Daytona Beach News Journal, he was advised by lawyers not to cooperate any further with the investigation. Now, as far as I was able to uncover, he has not spoken publicly about the incident since. A spokesperson for the sheriff's office told the press that foul play was not suspected. Instead, investigators were more interested in the possibility of faulty equipment. However, despite scouring all the men's gear, they couldn't find anything wrong with it. In fact, they even found that Samuel Slack's tank was still more than halfway full. Now, how could that be? How could Samuel Slack drown with breathable air literally strapped to his back? One illuminating but frustrating clue came after inspecting the valve on Slack's tank. It was turned only 1/4 of the way open. According to diving experts, that is not normal. If the valve isn't opened all the way, it can create difficulty breathing. We may never know for certain, but it seems like the best explanation for Slack's demise had something to do with his improperly opened valve on his tank. He suddenly found himself unable to get enough air, and in the depths of the water, he panicked. It was an issue that arose from his not knowing how to properly use the equipment, and an issue that persisted due to his not being able to handle the ensuing situation properly. 2 things, better training and proper certification, would likely have prevented this. But as we know, Samuel Slack never had either one. This proves, once again, that even if they might seem arbitrary sometimes, diving regulations are put in place for a reason. Slack didn't see any reason why he couldn't dive into the depths with his existing level of experience. And tragically, that puts him in the company of many other divers who overestimated their abilities and are now no longer with us. Florida resident Bruce Brewer was an excellent caver who spent hundreds of hours exploring below ground. One day, he took a group of 7 novice spelunkers on a tour through Georgia's Climax Caverns. It was a route he had traveled dozens of times before, But this time, he found something new, something shocking. High waters blocked the path to their exit, but Brewer wanted to press forward. Just as he began scouting the flooded sump, everything went wrong. Join us as we explore the haunting story of Bruce Brewer and the Climax Cave. 33-year-old Bruce Brewer was an instructor of photojournalism at Florida A&M University and a freelance photographer for both the Associated Press and the Tallahassee Democrat publications. Brewer lived in the Florida Panhandle his whole life, though his multiple talents and exceptional caving skills enabled him to travel all across the U.S. He was the perfect candidate for government-sponsored cave expeditions, and he was selected by the United States Forestry Service to venture into caves all across the U.S., from Florida to Alaska, and even across the waters to Puerto Rico and Hawaii. Brewer could tackle pretty much any cave he came across, but he was especially adept at exploring his local cave, Climax Caverns. Climax Cave is located near a drainage basin in Georgia's southwestern Decatur County. The Apalachicola River, the Chattahoochee River, and the Flint River combined to form the collective ACF River Basin, which converges at Decatur County. Some of these rivers start at the Georgia mountain range before combining into a single channel that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. The waters above ground created the perfect conditions to form caves like the one Brewer was preparing to explore. Climax Cave is around 225 miles south of Atlanta, and it's around 6 hours away from Florida's most populated cities, so many cavers have to plan for long trips to reach the cave. But Brewer only had to travel an hour to reach Climax Caverns from his lifelong home in Tallahassee, Florida. Climax Cave is named after a nearby town which was the terminus or end of a railroad in the 1800s. This cave was Brewer's home turf. He had been documenting Climax Caverns for over 10 years. And on top of all his other jobs and accolades, Brewer also wrote articles about his caving adventures. On Saturday, July 12, 2003, Brewer led a group of 7 cavers into Georgia's Climax Caverns. The team was well equipped with water-resistant socks, 2 pairs of shirts, knee pads, helmets, headlamps, flashlights, and backup batteries. They also brought cameras, a waterproof dry bag and a dry box, a vacuum bottle, and food supplies. Climax Cave has over 8 miles of cataloged passages, making it the second longest dry cave in the state of Georgia. It's been explored many times, but it is a real cave with deadly challenges that lie in wait. The cave is situated on private land near a highway and a dirt road. Only members of the National Speleological Society can access the cave, with permission from the landowner. After parking along a freshly manicured lawn by the highway, Brewer and his team trekked across a trail teeming with plants as they ventured into the forest. It wasn't long before they reached the entrance to Climax Caverns. The mouth of the cave could look like a pothole or a large vertical drop from afar. Upon closer inspection, the entrance slides down with a roughly 7-foot drop, followed by a steep crack that leads to another ledge. After a shorter step down and a total descent of 30 feet, the cave's entrance connects to a low-hanging ceiling that cavers squeeze through to enter the rest of the cave. Brewer was leading a team composed of ecologists from a research center. This caving trip wasn't an expedition into uncharted territory, but rather a simple tour that could encourage the researchers to further study Climax Cave and the unique wildlife found within its cold, dark interiors, like the Doherty plain crayfish and the Georgia blind salamander. Millions of years ago, Georgia was underwater, and dead sea creatures sank to the bottom of the waters. That ground would later become the site of Climax Cave, so even today, explorers can still find new fossils buried beneath the layers of limestone. The crew also brought sound equipment to record the calls of the various bat colonies found within the cave's dark corridors. But in spite of their scientific ambitions, Brewer was the only real caver there. All 7 researchers were new to the world of caving. For some, this trip to Climax Cave was their first time ever exploring a cave. Bruce wasn't worried. He knew this cave like the back of his hand. With his fearless attitude, he and his team entered Climax Caverns around noon. After winding down into the cave, their headlamps lit up the first large chamber. The ceiling dips down in waves, with many smooth ripples in the stone shaped by the flow of water over untold millennia. The first chamber is large, with shallow streams intersecting the pathway. There are 3 routes cavers can take once they enter this room. The first is a massive hole that descends further down. This section requires harnesses and ropes, so cavers need to be trained in vertical caving to explore deeper down this eerie pitfall. That option was a no-go. Then, there's a shaft that usually has water trickling down it, but despite the hazard, this path can be climbed without much trouble. And last, there's the chimney tube that can be climbed down, but it enters into the ceiling of another passage, so cavers must be suspended or risk injury by dropping down roughly 4 feet onto the floor below the tube. Bruce took them around what's known as the Loop, which was the usual route for tours. This route brings cavers through Climax Caverns' many awe-inspiring rooms, but it also poses some challenges that could be difficult for new cavers. The cavers journeyed onward through the Sand Crawl, a long, narrow tunnel where cavers scrape their stomachs and grasp the mud and stone while slowly worming their way through. In some areas, there's only a few inches separating the floor and ceiling for most of the passage, but there's just enough of a bell-shaped curve for cavers to pinch their way through. Today, the Sand Crawl is gated shut to prevent would-be explorers from getting stuck. Only experienced cavers or groups led by experts can venture further. Beyond the claustrophobic squeeze of the Sand Crawl, the ecologists were amazed by frosty speleothems, smooth, round stalactites dripping mineral water from the ceiling, rounded cairns, and calcite flowers that seemed to bloom across the cave walls. Eventually, they reached the Blue Hole Lake Room, which is accessed via a cliff that drops down into water. Below the slippery, rounded ledge, the cavers saw a clear pool of water with multiple fin-like shelves marking the various water lines the pool has dug over the years. Nearby, the team was amazed to find cave paintings and artifacts from the early days of the U.S. expansion into the land. The cavers then reached Razor Hall. They descended down a slippery ramp into a huge chamber filled with speleothems, rock formations created by various minerals interacting with flowing water. This chamber continues down to a low-hanging ceiling on the rocky shore of a mysterious lake. The water is only knee-deep for a while, allowing cavers to tiptoe their way to an enormous column of smooth dripstone with a stone beard dipping into the water. Just past the large rock formation in the pond, the ceiling juts down to divide Razor Hall into another chamber called the Turnage Room. Venturing past the structure, the water gets deeper until the ground gives way, revealing a tunnel that's partly submerged, a sump, or a flooded U-shaped tunnel. Bruce had expected the water levels to be low enough to cross the area through a narrow ledge, but the ledge was submerged. As a long-time veteran of Climax Cave, Bruce knew the history of these sumps. He recalled, on May 15, 1976, Guy Bryant, Bill Donahue, Court Smith, and David Nolan explored the South Climax Cave portion to venture beyond the sumps and expand the cave. They came back a month later with only 1 breathing tube, 1 pressure gauge, and 1 air tank each. They discovered that some of the pumps dried out during periods of low precipitation, and after many dives over the next few months, they managed to map out thousands of extra passages. Bryant's team was able to tackle the sumps with their old technology and with minimal gear, so the sumps shouldn't be that dangerous, right? Still, the water at Razor Hall confused Brewer. He knew that the water levels should be lower this time of year, and he knew he could tackle them, but even during the rainy season, this passage had never been that deep. He hadn't seen anything like this before. After all, George's Climax Cavern is supposed to be a dry cave. Bruce knew the cave had some flooded sections deeper down, but they weren't exploring that route. They reached this section around 8 p.m. Saturday night. They needed to cross into the Turnage Room to complete the loop. There were still more marvels to behold on the other side, and the team had been in the cave for over 9 hours at this point. Turning around could be just as dangerous as pushing forward. They were all amateurs, so if something went wrong, Brewer couldn't save them all by himself. Brewer thought about the situation. Since the water was never this high, it was likely that the sump was only a few feet long at most. That would mean that the group could simply duck under the ceiling to reach the other side. They'd only need to hold their breath for a moment, and they could form a human chain so that they couldn't get lost. If that didn't work, the team would have to turn around. Bruce decided to check out how deep the water really was. He waded across the water and over to the partition in the room. After glancing through the water, he made up his mind. Bruce had explored Climax Cave over 100 times, and he personally led dozens of groups along this same route. He was not going to let this strange flood halt their progress. Bruce informed his team that he would check out the passage to see if they could safely advance. He got rid of any excess gear, swam through the deep waters to the partition, took a gulp of stagnant cave air into his lungs, and dove below the surface of the water. Bruce was performing one of the most dangerous maneuvers in caving, free diving with no tanks of air, no goggles, and no rope to guide his path forward. The team of ecologists talked and looked around the room. Bruce said he shouldn't be gone long, so they waited patiently. The average adult can only hold their breath for 30 to 90 seconds. Bruce, as a physically fit caver, would likely be on the upper end. But as a minute passed by inside the chamber, the cavers began to get restless. They stared at the pool of water, its surface still and unbroken. No waves marked his hurried ascent. No bubbles indicated his arrival. The cavers stood in uncomfortable silence. One of the cavers was unsettled and asked if Brewer should be back by now. They said yes, but maybe he got to the other side and he was checking to make sure there weren't more sumps ahead. They agreed that would be the smart move. He was an expert. He knew what he was doing and they should trust him. But time kept ticking away. As more time elapsed, they turned off their lights to avoid wasting their precious batteries. That's when they saw a glow below the water. It had to be coming from Bruce's lamp. A few cavers swam to the partition and tried to reach for Bruce without fully going underwater. They had to cling to the slippery ceiling and the walls as they stretched toward the light. If they let go, they were afraid they wouldn't be able to make it back. The light was too far away. They couldn't reach Bruce. Another group decided to check side passages to see if he made it through to the other side of the sump. No sign of Brewer. After their search turned up empty, the cavers splintered into groups. One group would stay behind and nervously scout the waters, hoping for any sign of Brewer, while another group would call for a rescue team. Outside of Climax Cave, the scared team of ecologists initiated a search and rescue mission at around 2 a.m., 4 hours after Brewer vanished into Climax Caverns' seemingly endless waterlogged tunnel. 2 members of the local sheriff's office, who were also cave divers, answered the emergency call. They made it to Climax Cave straight away, but after seeing the absurd water levels, they called a Georgian caver, Will Summer, to help them. He was a local splunker who knew the cave about as well as Bruce did. Equipped with proper scuba gear, Summer and the other divers ducked below the sump. They hoped that Bruce's headlamp got caught on the jagged ceiling and he'd made it to the other side. If he surfaced without his headlamp, he wouldn't dare attempt the return trip blind. In that scenario, Bruce should be waiting on the other side of the pool, but that's not what happened. Cave divers quickly found the source of the light, and it was still attached to him. Bruce Brewer, the teacher and guide who inspired thousands of new cavers, was dead at the bottom of Climax Cave. His body was around 11 feet below the water. It took the team only a few minutes to bring his body out of the pool and onto the rocky shores of Razor Hall. However, with only 3 rescuers, they couldn't immediately bring his body to the surface. The heartbroken rescuers trudged their way to the forest above Climax Cave at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. After relaying the tragic news, cavers from far and wide drove straight to Georgia to bring Bruce to the surface for a proper burial. Over 130 rescuers joined forces in the recovery effort. The group was tired and demoralized, shocked at the loss of their local legend, friend, and fellow caver. Many of the cavers knew him through his work. Rescuers worked in shifts throughout the night, but many took extra breaks to grieve. Those who could collect themselves slowly began laying down rope, drilling anchors, and securing the exit route for their fallen friend. The first 3 rescuers who found him barely slept. They immediately ventured back inside to complete the recovery mission. Rescuers had to use chisels and air hammers to blast some of the crawl spaces apart to fit the stretcher that carried Bruce. It took the team the rest of Sunday to complete the extraction, while the crews struggled to come to terms with the disaster. By 4:19 a.m. on Monday morning, the rescuers returned Bruce's body to the surface of the Georgian forest. In one of the most gorgeous rooms of the cave, surrounded by the impossible structures only found deep underground, the cavers secured a memorial plaque that reads, "In memory of Bruce H. Brewer, caver, photographer, conservationist, and teacher. Your light will always shine." Bruce's story is both a warning to never underestimate the deadly power of nature and a celebration of those brave explorers who expanded maps and inspired cavers and nature lovers all over the world to carry the torch and forge their own stories of struggle, exploration, danger, and triumph as they venture into the untold depths of Earth's caves. What places inspire you? And would you ever dare to explore a true cave like this one? A network of caves sprawls beneath the tallest mountain in Spain. The volcanic Mount Teide formed hollow lava tubes, and humans have dug their own caves to study these phenomena. In spring of 2007, a group of 30 scientists and nature lovers ventured into one of the many labyrinths beneath Mount Teide. After a daring rescue, many would live to tell the tale, but some would perish. This is the tragic rescue in Barranco de los Cochinillos. The caves below Mount Teide. The caves on the island of Tenerife are different from normal caves. Many of these caves are volcanic caves or man-made caves created to study volcanic activity on the largest island of the Canary Islands. Tenerife is a volcanic island formed by a series of eruptions that caused lava to build layers of rock and metal. Over the last 20 million years, these layers gradually rose to a mountain peak, forming Mount Teide. One of these massive eruptions fused 3 of the Canary Islands, each with their own mountain ranges and volcanoes. In the aftermath, a crater was left in the center of the new island. This extinct volcano would become the base of the gargantuan Mount Teide. Tenerife is centered around the ominous Mount Teide, with its summit towering 12,188 feet above ground, or 24,600 feet above sea level, making it the tallest point in Spain and the 3rd tallest volcano on Earth. The crater of Mount Teide is 11 miles long, and beneath the volcano lies a sprawling network of lava tubes, cavernous tunnels formed by underground magma and above-ground lava flows. Barranco de los Cochinillos is a cave partially dug by humans over the past few centuries, mixing the lava tube structure with man-made tunnels bored with machines and blasts of dynamite. These tunnels were used to study the lava tubes and volcanic activity and to mine precious minerals. Some passages may connect to naturally formed lava tubes and other cave structures, creating a maze of tunnels underground. These tubes of rock lack the traditional speleoforms of regular caves, so they're less attractive to hikers and novice cavers. And they also lack the normal thrills that spelunkers crave. There's less water, less vertical sections, few tight crevices, and less uncharted territory to explore. But scientists have their own reasons for studying these caves, and lava tubes come with their own dangers that even experienced cavers might not be prepared for. Tenerife was also home to the worst flight accident in history, the Tenerife airport disaster. Back in 1977, a violent group of advocates wanted independence from Spain, so they set off a bomb at an airport. This caused chaos at other airports, including the Tenerife airport, which had to accept landings that were originally scheduled for different airports. On March 27th, the runways were overloaded. causing two Boeing 747 jumbo jets to smash into one another, killing 583 passengers. 40 years later, a group of would-be cavers, scientists, and nature enthusiasts would become the subjects of yet another notorious disaster on Tenerife. Only this time, the tragedy would be below ground. Brilliance and carelessness, the Tenerife cave disaster. Back in 2007, two groups joined forces to explore the cave of Barranco de los Cochonillos on Tenerife Island. The Canaries Astrophysics Institute was one of the groups exploring the cave. The island's rich volcanic activity and high elevation have attracted scientists from all over the globe. This institute is a state-of-the-art scientific research facility. The students and scientists there build sophisticated imaging devices like telescopes and cameras used for satellite missions. They research the solar system and how galaxies form. They also manage the Teide Observatory, which was built at high altitude to get closer to the stars without interference from city lights and the atmosphere. Now, if all of that wasn't impressive enough, one of the greatest minds in human history, the late Stephen Hawking, was an honorary professor at the Canaries Astrophysics Institute. So, why did these brilliant scientists turn their attention away from the stars to look down into the depths below our feet? This first group of roughly 15 people wanted to study the lava tubes beneath Mount Teide because these cave formations are also found on the Moon and on Mars. By exploring these caves, scientists can test robots that might one day search for life in Martian volcanic caves. The second half of the journey into Barranco de los Cochonillos was a group from the Tenerife Friends of Nature Association. Now, you'd expect scientists who don't normally study caves to team up with caving groups, but the Friends of Nature are just charity advocates for preservation efforts on the island. A couple members of the nature group said they had ventured into the cave before, but they were no splunkers. Both groups had no real guide and no caving experience, so if their journey turned deadly, they'd have almost no hope of survival. The joint expedition of roughly 30 people made mistake after mistake. The day of the cave exploration came, and the dry, arid climate of Tenerife had tricked the scientists and nature lovers into a false sense of security. They dressed in basic tracksuits and other athletic gear, skipping the wetsuits, sturdy overalls, watertight boots, and other insulating gear to protect them from mud, scrapes, slips, and the chill of the deep. Some might have thought that the magma from Mount Teide would keep them warm as they ventured further into the ground. Deeper into the ground, molten rock is still slithering through the earth, waiting for enough pressure to build when it can finally sunder the rock apart in a cataclysmic eruption. But the dried lava tubes were formed well above this molten stream. Millions of years of rock layers separated the would-be cavers from the heat of the magma. The lava tubes retained no heat and no comfort from the elements. Spirits were high as the group trekked into Barranco de los Cochonillos. The group was blissfully unaware of the dangers that lie ahead. There were almost no ropes, no extra food supplies, blankets, or other safety gear amongst the huge team of 30 cavers. Many of them even lacked light sources. These tragic mistakes didn't bother them at first, but as they trekked further inward, things slowly started to go wrong. Lava tubes are rocky, but they can also contain slippery, smooth metal. Over time, as the lava receded, the temperatures cooled, leaving sheets of mist and water that built up on the lava tube's metallic and rocky floor, making it slippery. The rough, uneven terrain of regular caves can be hazardous, but it also provides footholds and handholds for good grip. But they were slipping on the smooth ground. The walls of the cave were almost perfectly round, with nothing to grip onto if someone fell, and they had no walking sticks or other tools for balance. These smooth pathways were inviting. It'll be an easy walk, they thought, but they were fatiguing earlier than expected, which forced them to take breaks and extend the trip. To make matters worse, All the tubes and tunnels all started to look the same. There aren't many discernible features in Barranco de los Cochinillos. There were no inspiring stalactites, no cracks, no rivers, no cliffs, just a true labyrinth of stone and metal. The team continued onward as their energy and optimism faded into concern and frustration. At one point, one of the explorers, Narciso H., slipped and fell. The groups in the front didn't even notice, but he dusted himself off and continued walking. As they trudged on, Narciso started breathing heavy and he got a headache. Not wanting to worry the team more after his embarrassing fall, he kept it to himself. But soon, more people started to breathe heavier and faster. Some of the scientists led sedentary lifestyles, but many of the nature group were fit and fully capable of exploring this easy walkway. Except they also started breathing heavy. They each started to get headaches. They passed them off with excuses like maybe they didn't get enough food, maybe it was the low light. But soon, these headaches became unbearable, forcing more breaks as people paused to clutch their heads. Then, some members noticed an acidic taste in their mouths. Voices of concern started to rise from members of the party in short, gasping sentences. Their vision was blurring, their heads spinning with vertigo. Narciso H. leaned on the smooth walls of the cave, trying to catch his balance, but his legs gave way underneath him. Stars overtook his vision, different from the ones he gazed at with his state-of-the-art telescopes. These ones were caused by lack of oxygen to his brain. Starved of its fuel, his conscious brain shut off. His head bounced off the cavern wall, causing his bald flesh to bleed as he fell to the cavern floor. Others collapsed where they stood. Still more fell to their hands and knees as their heads bobbed, throbbing with pain and confusion. Some of the members tried to drag people in the opposite direction, but the physical exertion made them breathe deeper. Only one of the 30 explorers was still standing near the back of the group. He had fallen behind to check out strange layers of stone along a portion of the wall. His headlamp showed a ghastly sight as he rejoined his friends and colleagues. All of them were lying on the ground unconscious. He didn't know if they were alive or dead, but he turned and half ran toward the entrance cave, being careful not to slip and fall. The final mistake and a miraculous rescue. Deep below Mount Teide, the explorers started waking up. They were amazed they were alive, but they couldn't celebrate their luck. They were now coughing as their raspy voices echoed through the tunnels. They checked their watches. They had been passed out on the cave floor for over 2 hours. They were still dizzy, and hypothermia had begun to settle into their bones while they were unconscious. They shivered, gnashing their teeth in the biting chill of Barranco de los Cochinillos cavern. Panicked, they started hypothesizing about what had happened. The obvious answer was gas from the magma beneath the cave. If it was volcanic gas, then they had no idea when more could seep through the rock and suffocate them again. However, some of the explorers weren't convinced of the danger. They dubbed it a freak accident. They had been down here before, and no problems like this ever happened. Mount Teide wasn't very active, so it was very unlikely that another gas leak could happen. It would require molten rock to interact with other chemicals to burn. Even if chemicals were burning right now, it would require large amounts to build up enough pressure to overcome the atmospheric pressure of the cave, which gets stronger the deeper you go. It would probably take days, weeks, or even years for enough pressure to build before another gas leak fumigated Barranco de los Cochinillos. Or so they thought. 6 members of the group agreed to push onward, even as their heads pounded in pain. But the rest weren't going to risk it. They started walking to the exits. They were already feeling the pressure of a life and death situation, reinvigorated to get out as soon as possible. The only question was, which way is out? The chaos of the situation had disoriented them. When they awoke, they weren't sure which way was forward and which way was back. Panic erupted through the ranks. It was every person for themselves. Around this time, the only scientist who didn't pass out fell on his face as he stumbled out through the exit of Barranco de los Cochinillos. Eventually, he shuffled further out and called for help. The Spanish Mountain Rescue and Intervention Groups, or GRIME, sent their special unit over to the scene, but they were a good distance away. Local fire squads and other first responders got there in no time. Just as they arrived, more people started pouring out of the cave. They thought it was a miracle. There were so many people here, they must have all made it out. But slowly they realized half the group was still missing. The rescue crews knew that the man-made portion of the cave ended in a dead end. If the others reached that portion, they could wait for rescue or turn around. The rescuers knew where to find them as long as they didn't wander down any side passages or any new connection points. They got to work situating large fans at the cave's entrance to vent any fumes out of the cave. Some of these industrial-sized rescue fans are capable of clearing the air in subway sewers, so they could surely handle the cave. Rescuers suited up with respirators and gas masks to filter the air, allowing them safe passage into the cave. Since the cave didn't have the typical hazards, rescuers brought the bare minimum equipment. Some stretchers that could be pulled along the ground, attached to ropes or carried, and some rope and carabiners to attach themselves to the skids. There shouldn't be any tough cave formations to haul the cavers through. It should be in and out, unless any of them sustained physical trauma. The rescue team walked silently into the depths of Barranco de los Cochinillos. After less than an hour, the rescuers found the first group and slowly brought them out one at a time. Of those who made it out, 6 foreign scientists and members of the nature crew were immediately loaded onto helicopters and airlifted to a nearby hospital. Meanwhile, half of the crew ventured deeper within. They heard no sound as they crept inward. They saw no lights. No one knew it at the time, but this group of scientists and explorers weren't exposed to deadly gases released by magma from deep below. The amateur cavers were suffocating. There were too many people in the constricted tunnels of Barranco de los Cochinillos, and they were simply running out of air. As they inhaled all the remaining oxygen-rich air, they exhaled carbon dioxide, a colorless, odorless gas that causes all the symptoms they were experiencing earlier. Normal CO2 levels are around 0.03%, but the amount in caves can easily rise above that baseline. Caves with 1% CO2 or more are dubbed foul air caves, and a concentration of 10% or more could instantly stop human lungs from functioning. Earlier in the day, the CO2 levels were just high enough to cause everyone to pass out. But as they passed out, their breathing slowed down, allowing the CO2 levels to drop. If they had brought an experienced caver with them, they could have stood a chance. Cavers developed the naked flame test for this exact situation. You just light a flame and walk forward to test the air. For decades, cavers thought high CO2 atmospheres would cause flames to burn out, and that's true. But it turns out that a flame will burn out in any low oxygen environment, including those tainted by other toxins. They were brilliant scientists, but they knew about the gas of the stars, not about the air inside caves. A group of 6 ambitious cavers found the end of the tunnel. They thought it would be good to rest. There was no obvious signs of additional gas leak, but once again, their logic failed them. There was already low oxygen in the area, and each shallow breath they took exhaled more of the same poisonous carbon dioxide into the air. The fresh air from beyond this pocket couldn't reach them. All the atmospheric pressure concentrated the air into this very spot. As they stood there at the cave's end, the CO2 levels rose once more, and each of them collapsed again. Only this time, they didn't wake up. Rescuers squeezed through the narrowing tunnels leading to the dead end and found them. 1 Italian man studying at the Astrophysics Institute and 5 other Spanish people, all dead. Now, as far as cave deaths go, they died peacefully rather than the violent, agonizing, and panic deaths that normally claim the lives of spelunkers. Pridhamsley Cave is supposed to be an easy beginner cave. Now, even though it's not a commercial show cave, professional splunkers often lead groups of new cavers and even class trips through Pridhamsley's dark, twisting corridors. But one day, in 2006, the cave nearly claimed the life of a fledgling caver named Emily when she fell onto the cold, hard stone. Emily vowed to join the team that saved her, but 5 years later, she mysteriously lost her grip again. This time, rescuers weren't sure if she could make it out alive. To uncover the mystery behind Emily's double rescue story, we have to travel to England's southwestern county of Devon. The countryside of Devon is filled with rolling hills and steep cliffs that form deep limestone passages as waves crash against jagged coasts. Port towns climb up the mountainsides, and boats fill the harbors. Devon's unique land makes it the perfect place for caves to form, and some of these caves contain human remains that are over 30,000 years old. Pridhamsley Cave is just one of many in the area, but it's popular with beginners from all across England. People from urban London can reach the cave by a 2-hour train ride, followed by another half-hour drive, and then a 15-minute walk from the road. The cave is difficult to survey not because it's hard to explore, but because it has many twisting and interconnected layers. Surveys end up looking like illegible messes as splunkers try to draw the overlapping pathways. There's only one updated map available at a nearby library, so new cavers can't research their routes before traveling to the area. Cavers descending into Pridhamsley rely on guides who know the passages, blissfully unaware of the deadly traps awaiting them below. Outdoor groups like Somerset Adventures will take new cavers on paid tours through the caverns, but make no mistake, Pridhamsley Cave is the real deal. It might be easy enough to reliably take newbies through it, but it does require serious caving gear, and the cave will present difficult maneuvers for those not yet baptized by the muddy waters below ground. Back in 2006, a determined caver named Emily set foot into Pridhamsley with a few others. She was only 19 at the time and excited to explore real caving. Their group ducked under the mossy ceiling of rock that hung above the cave entrance. Once inside, they looked around, expecting to walk into a large room, but the guide pointed out that the entrance to the rest of the cave was a small hole in the rock wall near the ground. Now, some members were already having second thoughts as they squeezed through the narrow opening. Their guides did their best to reassure them that the cave would open up and encourage them to see it through. Shortly after crawling through the entrance to Pridhamsley, the tour met a wall of rock that was nearly vertical. The guide asked the new cavers if they wanted to try climbing this 23-foot wall, without ropes. Trips into Pridhamsley often forego ropes and harnesses. Now, these safety measures might not be necessary for experienced cavers, but even other, easier caves will use ropes for added safety, especially for beginners. Sometimes people freeze on the rocks, not from cold, but from fear. They become paralyzed on the wall when the only way is down. Adding to the immediate horror, the guide informed them that the wall had only a few holds that almost required shorter cavers to jump to reach them. One member attempted the climb, struggled, and shook with fear as his unconditioned hands struggled to grip the smooth limestone. He made it to the top, but his legs were shaky and he was out of breath. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air before the guide laughed and told them there were easier routes. Emily felt upstaged by her fellow caver, but she kept her pride in check, and she listened as the guide pointed out different routes they could take. Along the way, they saw the Little Man rock formation, and they remarked on how cute it looked, not realizing that its human-like form was a dark omen, with its head and feet anchored to the cave ceiling and walls, trapped in place. The team progressed, as walls both sharp and smooth bit down on cavers, snagging clothes and getting some members briefly stuck. The next section along their route was a 50-foot squeeze that forced the adults to contort their shoulders. They slowly wormed through the squeeze, pressing one arm against their bodies, pulling it down toward their waist, while bringing their other shoulder up to their ears to reduce the width of their shoulders. This advanced technique made them just narrow enough to make it through. If anyone panicked or changed the position of their arms, they could be trapped. There's not enough space to move your arms or even crawl forward. Following this section, the cave opens up to the changing room. To progress to the deeper portions of the cave called Prid 2, cavers have to switch to diving gear. This area diverges into 3 different pathways: the underwater cellar, the mud escalator, and the coal chute. While ropes are discouraged in the earlier portion of the cave, this region does have a rope that extends into the water to guide divers. The sumps in Pridhamsley are short, and many cavers choose to free dive without the use of oxygen tanks. Divers only need to hold their breath for a few seconds on the first sump, and then roughly 30 seconds on the second. Now, even though that's easy to do under normal circumstances, these short passages could easily be deadly for newbies. Divers following the rope might notice other underwater passages, so inexperienced or ambitious divers could easily get lost. At around 80 feet down, the lake twists up into the largest chamber in the cave, dubbed Jerry's Chamber. The lake in Jerry's Chamber is home to eerie white cave shrimps, but this area is a dead end. Cavers who venture here have to swim out through the same opening and risk drowning as they search for the guiding rope, followed by another 80-foot swim for air. There are other ways out, but they're also risky. Another exit forces people to wade into the water and duck below a rocky outcropping. The next section is almost entirely submerged, with barely enough room between the water and the ceiling to keep your mouth out of the water. It was near the changing room that things went wrong for Emily. The last exit is through the mud escalator, a 16-foot-tall ramp that's covered in mud. Just like the entrance, this area has few holds. Emily chose this section and began climbing up the thick sludge on the cave wall. She didn't get far. This section was around 300 feet into the cave. She tried to go up the steep, muddied wall, but just a few feet off the ground, she slipped. She didn't even know what happened, but the next thing she remembered, she was on her back. Then came the pain. She had slipped and fallen straight onto her back. Emily lay on her back, writhing in pain. They weren't sure what happened, but she was weak and her limbs started to occasionally spasm. She was still conscious and the movement wasn't too strong, but there was signs of serious injury. One of the guides charged through the exit and immediately called the Devon Cave Rescue Organization. As part of the British Cave Rescue Council, the DCRO has a special off-road ambulance, a management vehicle, and access to an extended Coast Guard rescue helicopter. This full volunteer service group has been around since 1965. They're fast and professional, and they dispatch their teams straight away. Inside the cave, Emily groaned in pain. The spine sends signals from the brain to the limbs, and spasms could mean that the delicate nerves were slashed or punctured. Any wrong move could sever her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed. So far, she wasn't numb, but instead, damaging her central nervous system had set her whole body on fire with pain. Within the first hour, rescuers arrived, bringing a flexible stretcher that could fit in Pridhamsley's tight tunnels. Teams were equipped with underground radios to communicate, and the rescuers anchored wire ladders near the exit for better handholds while they climbed out with the stretcher connected to their harnesses. Emily still had feeling and movement in her limbs, which meant she was probably going to make it out just fine. It took teams 3 hours to pry her from the cave. Based on reports of her potential spinal injury, the team brought the airlift, loaded her into the helicopter, and took her to safety. Doctors thought her strange twitching after the fall was the result of trauma to nerves and possibly psychological shock. She had a bruised spine and some fractures, but nothing too serious. Emily wasn't crushed by her rescue. Instead, she turned her frightening experience into ambition. After she recovered, she joined the Devon Cave Rescue Organization and became their secretary. But rescuers and her fellow cavers were puzzled by what had happened. She wasn't that far up the mud escalator, and she didn't have any signs of fatigue. Plus, the way she fell didn't look like a slip. Then there was the strange reaction that happened when she landed. Within a few years' time, the answer behind Emily's mysterious fall would be revealed when Emily had her second cave rescue, and this one was much worse. In 2011, Emily was exploring an abandoned mining tunnel connected near England's caves when something went wrong again. Her hands failed to grip a wire ladder, much like the one used to save her before. Her vision went dark, and she fell onto her back again. This time, though, she was more advanced. She was with a small team of cavers, and there was no expert guide. Her friends rushed to her, but this wasn't a simple injury like before. She was immediately in a life and death situation. This time, she lost consciousness. Over the next few hours, she came back to consciousness, only to pass out again as the cycle kept repeating. Prior to this trip, she had revealed the secret of her accident in Pridhamsley Cave. Emily suffered from epilepsy. Both cave rescues were caused by epileptic seizures. Epilepsy is a condition where the brain produces abnormal signals that lead to seizures. In Pridhamsley, Emily might have had an atonic seizure, otherwise known as a drop seizure, which caused her muscles to stop working in the middle of her climb. But now, her brain signals were completely haywire. She might have been experiencing a tonic-clonic or a grand mal seizure, the most extreme side effect of epilepsy. People experiencing grand mal seizures might go stiff or shake uncontrollably, and in rare cases, these catastrophic events could prevent patients from breathing, or even instantly stop their heart from beating. Her friends and fellow cavers tried to stay by her side as she convulsed on the cave floor. 2 members of the party climbed out of the cave, but it was a slow process. It took them around an hour to reach the surface where they could call for emergency rescue services. They informed rescuers that Emily was mostly unresponsive, slipping in and out of consciousness, that she had fallen on her back just a few years prior in Pridhamsley, and that they were in a vertical cave that went deep into the earth. This time, over 50 rescuers rushed to the wilderness. This wasn't a simple in-and-out cave rescue. This was a matter of life and death. Every second counted, and crews had to improvise a plan. The first rescuers to arrive were volunteer cavers and climbers. They could easily traverse the cave and reach her to assess her condition. Rescuers rappelled down the vertical cave walls blasted apart by mining machines. The rescuers reached her and started checking her vitals. In her fleeting moments of lucidity, they asked Emily about what she was experiencing or if she had any prior conditions. But, fearing she might be removed from her position with the Devon rescue team, she tried to cover up her own condition. The rescuers who arrived knew something was wrong. If this wasn't a prior condition, well, then Emily might have sustained serious nerve damage to cause this type of reaction. They all began to slowly realize another terrible detail. This underground tunnel had been a lead mine. Lead is a heavy radioactive metal. Exposure to low-grade radiation for brief intervals can be safe. That's why the cavers were here in the first place. If the team had completed their cave trip, then they wouldn't need to worry. But this rescue could easily take 4 times longer than they were supposed to be down here. Each second that goes by could increase their risk of permanent injury and cancer. To make matters worse, the area could expel toxic fumes, or dust from the mines could get picked up as they drill holes for ropes and pulleys. Lead dust is far more dangerous than low-level background radiation. Lead particles can enter the lungs where they can sit permanently, lodging themselves into delicate tissues or even find their way into the bloodstream through the alveoli. Once inside the body, lead dust continues to release low-grade radiation. But without a means of escape, this means those exposed are all but guaranteed to get cancer or other life-ending conditions. The rescuers called for better medical backup, and they called the Hazardous Area Response Team, who were trained in dealing with dangerous environments like the lead mines. Rescuers also brought mining engineers who could navigate the mining tunnels that intersect with caves. These technicians also had knowledge on how to create microblasts to dislodge trapped cavers. Paramedics brought anesthesia to numb her pain, but if her nerve damage was too severe, they might not be able to use it, since it could increase the risk her lungs might fail. The first paramedic arrived and deduced that she did have another spinal injury. This time, her pelvis had also been damaged from the fall. As hours passed by, she and her friends realized they had to come clean. Luckily, Emily's group of cavers knew about her condition and gave her medication to block signals in her brain or change the flow of ions to reduce her brain's signal noise and lower the effects of her seizure. They administered the medicine just before the rescuers arrived. If this step hadn't been completed, it's likely that the combination of spinal injury plus the misfiring neurons would have been the death of Emily. Her friends had to risk their own safety to save her. To give her the medicine, they had to get near her mouth, but one wrong move could cause her to bite through her own tongue. She could choke on her tongue or bleed out from severed nerves, or she could involuntarily bite their fingers off. The above-ground part rescue team had a new problem. The cave's entrance was a huge vertical shaft that had to be climbed down. There was no way for them to affix normal pulleys onto the rock with no ceiling above them. Instead, the team used a tripod rope system with a winch to hoist her up a 300-foot cliff and out of the cave. The paramedic attending her wasn't skilled in vertical caving, so they had to be hoisted up the mine shaft with her. They began the slow journey upward as the winch creaked and groaned as dozens of onlookers leaned over the edge with headlamps and bated breath. It took 30 minutes to slowly raise them up the 300-foot hole. They had to check for any problems with their equipment and maintain a close eye on Emily's condition. The rescuers heard she had survived a fall once before, and her friends told them that she had joined a different group, becoming a volunteer rescuer like them. This news sparked a fire inside them, and they all pulled together to work harder than ever. Eventually, Emily was hoisted above the hole into the ghost town above. The whole rescue operation took 6 hours, double Emily's previous rescue, but much faster than the rescuers had anticipated. All in all, Emily spent 9 hours being rescued over the years. She played with fire by not talking about her condition, but sufferers of chronic medical conditions can often be stigmatized. She did her best to live a full life, and she didn't let her injuries or her epilepsy hold her back. She kept on caving and fighting to rescue others just as they rescued her. Thanks for watching. Emily kept striving when many people would have given up. What keeps you motivated to achieve your goals? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more rescue stories.